Hello, and welcome to yet another episode of the Conversation Capital. Hey, girl.
Hey, how are you?
Focus. How are you doing?
I'm well, thanks, and how are you?
I am awesome. Thank you. Give, are you with us?
Yeah, here and there.
Here and there.
Yeah.
Okay. Hi, how are you doing?
Oh, I'm good. Sorry, I thought...
You guys are not focused, and I don't like it, actually. So today we're discussing all things to do with vaccines. And so I was doing a little course at work. And then I was lucky enough to be in a room with a vaccinologist. And as soon as he said what he does, I was like, you need to come on to my show. Daniel, hi, how are you?
Hey, I'm doing great. How are you doing?
I am awesome. Thank you. So my understanding is that you're doing a PhD in vaccinology.
Indeed. Yeah. Just finished my first year of my PhD. It's surviving so far.
You and I are in the same boat. I was just coming towards the end of my first year, and I don't know if I'm surviving, but yes, we're here.
I'm sure you're killing it.
It's really cool to have you, and maybe let's just stepping right into the episode. What is it to be a vaccinologist? What is a vaccine? And how did you get to there?
I think so. Vaccinology as a unique sort of term is quite new, but what it really is just kind of it's an amalgamation of the different disciplines that make up vaccinology. So you've got a bit of immunology and virology and sort of regulatory stuff, vaccine production, and we train in all of those sort of things, and then you kind of find your own niche and you specialize in that. So what I've really kind of gotten into is the more immunology side of vaccines, and I look at the long-term immunology and see, years down the line after a child gets a vaccine, what is the immune response still looking like? Are they still protected? Do we need to maybe rethink how we're using this vaccine? Do we need to change the schedule or that kind of thing?
But let's back to grassroots. What's a vaccine?
So, what's a vaccine?
Like the actual, what does it actually do? How does it work?
So a vaccine, in a sentence, it's a medicine that we create that can simulate being infected with a virus or a bacteria and help your body train how to fight it without the risk of actually getting the disease. Right? So your body has an immune system, and part of that immune system is what we call the adaptive immune system. So this is the part that learns about different things that your body's been exposed to and remembers them. So that the next time you encounter that specific thing, your body says, hey, I know you, I know how to fight you, right? And then hopefully you'll get less sick, or maybe your body will prevent you getting sick, right? But the problem with that is you need to get sick first, right? You need to get the disease first.
Yes.
With a vaccine, you get that training and you get that immune priming, but you don't have to get the disease.
Is this the reason that usually when people move to a foreign place, a new place, there's a period, like maybe after a month or 2 months, where they're fine and then they get like deadly ill? Is it that they're adapting to the sickness of that area or the viruses of that area? So that's always just my assumption.
Yeah, like if you're moving to a completely new geographical region, like if you're going from Southern Africa to Europe, for example, like there will be some pathogens, or maybe there'll be a different strain of a virus, or there'll be a different bacteria that you wouldn't have encountered in your region back home. So you would be then susceptible to that kind of thing. And that's another way that we can use vaccines. I mean, for example, if you live in South Africa but you want to go on holiday in some parts of Southeast Asia or whatever, you need to get a yellow fever vaccine, right? And that's because there's no yellow fever in South Africa, so you would not naturally have acquired any sort of immunity. So when you're going to go into an area with that, then you can use a vaccine to give you some protection and avoid exactly what you're talking about.
Yes. Okay. I look like you wanted to say something. No, okay. So let's look at, if everything is so above board, like everything that you're explaining just sounds quite scientific, quite standard. What's the stigma around vaccines? Let's get into that. Why is it that some people, we call them anti-vaxxers?
Yes.
So we prefer to use the term vaccine hesitancy.
Ooh, I like that.
Right? I think I think that in general, and this is not vaccine specific, this is just in conversations that human beings have. There's quite often we're positioned to have an us and them perspective, right?
Oh.
Like either you're with us or you're against us.
Yes.
But the world is not
Black and
so
white.
black and white.
Yeah.
The world is just shades of gray, right? So I don't like to call them anti-vaxxers because then I'm immediately positioning an us and them.
That's so true.
People have vaccine hesitancy.
Okay.
And there are degrees of vaccine hesitancy, and some people are very strongly vaccine hesitant. But there are, I believe that there are, if you have an environment where you can have an open discussion, you can have a calm, engaging discussion. There's a lot of ways that we can foster communication that can maybe try and battle vaccine hesitancy, right? I think the cause of it is interesting. I mean, it's, I think part of it is associated with governance and authority and that kind of thing. There's a huge link between vaccine hesitancy or vaccine acceptance and trust in government.
Yeah.
If you live in a situation where you have very little trust in your government and your government is actively endorsing something, then it naturally positions you to think, oh, maybe I don't want to be a part of that.
Yes.
Vaccine campaigns are a very good example, right? You may believe sort of certain things about big pharma or that kind of thing,
Yes.
and that may position you to not want to do it.
Yeah.
It also, I think, a huge part of it is about the fact that this kind of science is and remains very inaccessible to most people. I mean, I went through matric biology and my undergraduate degree in biology, and I only really started understanding the immune system. And I mean, I don't even know if anyone really understands it. You know what I mean? But it's so, but I had to get to this level, like a master's and PhD level, to really get to the bottom of how vaccines work and that kind of thing. And that's obviously unreasonable to expect the majority of the population to get a master's degree in vaccinology. But I think that we can increase our basic education and the way that we train people to think about the information that they're getting, right? Because you don't necessarily need to understand a topic technically to be able to tell whether or not the information you're being given is logical and reasonable and most likely correct, right? That's more critical thinking ability, and that's very linked to education. So I think if you look at countries where, for example, Finland, right, during the COVID-19 pandemic, Finland had the highest vaccine uptake, the highest vaccine acceptance rate globally, I think. And they also happen to have a very high literacy rate and a very high education rate, right? And then there's a direct correlation with those things. You can, as you move down the scale of countries and their level of vaccine acceptance, you also see decreases in basic education levels and literacy levels.
Yeah, and it trickles down to the communities that base the source of information off a video on WhatsApp.
Exactly.
Forwarded many times.
Exactly.
Which is one person who's explaining in a very simplistic way why not to take it.
Yeah.
Whereas sometimes that kind of information isn't necessarily as accessible.
Yeah.
And maybe sometimes even just like you're saying, the literacy of it and the language that's used.
Exactly. That's a huge thing.
Yeah. I was following how the vaccines work, and a part of me, as you were saying this now, wonders if I was following because I learned it in undergrad. Do you get what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Or is it really that, sometimes it's a bit difficult to like break down as simply as ABC or whatever have you. And so sometimes that maybe we lose people along the way in things like that. Whereas, what did you call them?
Vaccine hesitance.
Vaccine hesitancy extremists, have a way of simplifying their argument in a way that, but okay, let's talk about there should be some level of truth to hesitance, or a better way to, I mean, I'm trying to, I don't know how to word it, but I'm trying to get to what you spoke about, the population differences and tailoring vaccines, what you spoke to off camera.
Yeah.
And so maybe could that be one of the reasons that give vaccine hesitant individuals a leg to stand on? So maybe let's just start with explaining what you had explained to us. Yeah.
So I was explaining before we started recording how there's a field called immunogenetics, and that really looks at the relationship between genetic mutations and variations in human beings and how they can influence immune responses. And I mean, a good example of explaining how those mutations work is like every human being in the world has eyes, and our eyes all effectively work the same. But a lot of people, like this, everyone has different color eyes. So there are slight variations in the proteins that make up those pigments and, that kind of thing that can generate these structural or functional differences, right? So in the proteins that are involved in your immune system, you can have variations, and you can have, for example, if there's a virus that uses a particular receptor to infect a cell, that receptor could have a popular mutation in one geographical area or population that is different to the way it is structured in another population. So that virus may be able to infect people in population 1 better than population 2, right?
And simply because of the genetics of that area.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right. And the problem is that when it comes to vaccines, but also like generally pharmaceutical agents, you ideally we're reaching a level of understanding where it's kind of making sense to look at the feasibility of creating vaccines that are targeted for populations, right?
Yes.
The problem is it's a very difficult thing to navigate because there's a huge amount of cost involved with vaccine production. And, now if you say, well, I have a rotavirus vaccine, but I now need to make a new vaccine for Sub-Saharan Africa, for Southwest Asia, for Europe, you know what I mean? You need someone to be prepared to do that. But there is definitely, I mean, like, for example, specifically in Africa, there is, like, a lot of people believe that pharmaceutical companies test unfairly in African populations, or
is there truth to that?
No, there isn't, because
in the past,
I mean, if you go way back, you could perhaps see exploitation in many different industries and fields, but I think that certainly with regards to medical trials and that kind of thing, the development of medical ethics codes and that kind of thing have really enforced a much more equal playing field when it comes to how you actually test a product in different environments and different populations. I mean, now, the way that we would, if you want to do a population specific trial, that's one thing. And there's a very rigorous procedure you go through with ethics and, with that kind of thing to make sure that what you're going to be doing is above board. But especially if you are doing a multi-center study where, let's say and this happened a lot with the COVID vaccine, so you'd have a trial site in England and a trial site in South Africa. You had to make sure that the way that those trial sites were run is identical. Like, everything that is happening is identical, because otherwise it compromises the results of your trial. Right? How are you going to have statistical accuracy and statistical homogeny if your different trial sites are run differently, right? Or if your participants are treated differently, right?
So you're saying that nowadays, in this day and age that we live in, there's an ethical standard that everybody kind of needs to meet.
Exactly, yeah.
And so you're saying that relax.
Yeah,
Africans
and that's-
aren't being given
And
a
processes
substandard
are very
vaccine.
rigorous, Shem. Research is very rigorous.
Yes, no,
Yeah.
even as you were speaking of the ethical, I mean, anybody that's doing a study at any university, I won't
Yeah.
even say specifically any institution, to get ethical clearance is the first hurdle
Yeah.
of getting your master's or
Absolutely.
PhD. It can
Yeah.
take months, some people, unfortunately, even years.
And it's an iterative process. You need to keep your ethics board updated with what you're doing.
Yes.
If you want to change the tiniest thing, you need to go through an amendment procedure. You know, you as medical researchers, we don't just have carte blanche to do whatever we want.
Yes,
Yeah.
You know, and
absolutely.
that's really important.
Yeah. I can empathize though with the history of it. You know, when you look at the history historically, how it was taken, I can see people's hesitance. But it's, you know, just to say that, okay, guys, this is not that era.
Yeah.
You know, yeah.
But it's also, you know, it's a difficult subject to broach.
Yes.
Because if you look at, you know, like we were talking a bit about sort of decolonialization
Yes.
and
Yeah.
and there's a huge push for that in education and that kind of things, and I think what is a delicate line to tread is where there are like lingering effects of colonialization that need to be addressed, and where there is equality and equity in how things are handled. And I think medical research is one of those areas where for a while now we have had a pretty level playing field. You know what I mean? And I think the other thing is like when you put research out, right, nowadays, you know, I mean, if you go back to pre-internet days,
Yeah.
and your journal was in print, and
Yes.
if someone wanted to read it, they had to know about the you know what I mean? They had to,
Yes, yeah.
like, it was very select.
yeah.
But now it's super easy
Google
to go
Scholar.
and find,
Yeah.
you know, even papers that are behind paywalls you can access, right? So if you are going to put out bad research, you are going to get called out on it very quickly,
That's true.
right?
This is very
And if
true.
you haven't, you know, in your paper that you publish, if you haven't shown that you had ethical clearance, you haven't shown which the ethical review board that gave you ethical clearance was, you know, you haven't outlined your methodology, especially your statistical methods, that kind of stuff. You know, people are going to call you out. And it's, I mean, look what happened, you know, in the best example, right? In, I can't remember if it was the 80s or 90s, a completely fraudulent scientist put out a paper saying that the MMR vaccine causes autism, right? And he had literally made up data. He had decided he wanted to show this, and he used completely unethical methods and really fudged statistics and fraudulent data to support this conclusion that he had decided he wanted to prove. And since then, there have been literally thousands upon thousands of independent studies that have shown that there is no link between vaccines and autism. There is no link, right? But that one paper has caused so much damage,
Yep.
Yes.
right? But how quickly was, I mean, the paper, like, right after putting it out, other people in the scientific community said that doesn't seem right. And then they proved it was
Yes,
wrong.
yes.
And the paper was retracted.
Yes.
And, you know, the journal that published it pulled it down immediately. You can't find that paper anywhere
Yes,
now,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
So the scientific community reacts quickly
Yes,
when someone does something that is not
Yeah.
above board.
Yeah.
You know?
But you know, now we're definitely getting into a bit of an ethical, but we needed to touch on it because I think there's so many questions around how ethical are these things and so forth and so on that make
There's one
people
thing I
quite
wanted
hesitant.
to add to this, that the conversation of people trusting vaccines, to a large extent, you might find is influenced by things that have nothing to do with the medical industry, or maybe it does, but not particularly with vaccines. Like, I wonder what's the relationship between trusting a vaccine from a particular company and the fact that Coke so many years ago used to use coca leaves in Coke. The person who watched that video or other conspiracies or other places where we found government to be corrupt, though those issues influencing whether we trust this vaccine or not. Like it has nothing to do with how strict medicine is, with WHO. Like it literally has nothing to do with any of that. People are just so easy to believe these stories because they do have evidence of organizations and institutions, and particularly with companies and governments. I think it probably and I don't know, perhaps this would have to be questions that you ask those. I know I had a friend who was a strong anti-vaxxer or, you know,
vaccine hesitant.
Yeah, he was
strongly vaccine hesitant.
Vaccine hesitant.
Yeah.
Like we literally, I even told him that, dude, my partner had it. Like, you know her, you've known her since forever. To him, she was imagining COVID. Right? And I'm like, dude, are you being serious right now? Like, and then I got it. And I'm like, dude, are you saying right now?
Yeah.
I'm imagining this thing.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of people said, no, there is something making people sick, but it's not COVID. Like, you know what I mean? It's not like obvious, like, cause if someone is literally sick in front of you, you can't deny that. So there would be like, a lot of people would say, okay, no, I accept that there is an illness going around, but I don't believe this stuff about COVID, for example. You know what I mean? And but I, you know, I think, and what you're saying is completely correct. And you know, the problem is that trust is very difficult to maintain and restore. And I think, you know, if you look at an institution, you know, whether it's government or a company that you know or whatever, if you think of an institution that has done something that has fractured your trust in that institution, now the lengths that they would have to go through to restore that trust are, you know, it's way bigger than the transgression may have been. Yes. You know what I mean? I mean, and like there are noted examples of when, for example, a pharmaceutical company acted unethically. But the, you know, the thing is, if there is an incident like that, it doesn't nullify everything that company may ever subsequently do, as long as you can show that things were then, like, the ethical process was then restored. You know what I mean? And the ethical transgression was addressed. You know what I mean?
And just to add to Given's point, in how the hesitance may not be related to the actual science, with regards to the particular vaccine. I just remember how with COVID, people were saying it's to put in track devices. So that tracking devices, I think, in us, or what was it, 3G? I can't remember.
5G.
Yeah, 5G. Yeah. But it wasn't in relation to the vaccine per se, but what is the mandate behind that vaccine? So Given's quite right in there. Yeah.
And I mean, it's, you know, there are loads of conspiracy theories, and if you look at a lot of the arguments that these conspiracy theories are built on, or that advocates for who are, you know, vaccine hesitancy and advocates who say advocates for not getting vaccinated. A lot of their arguments are built on what we call logical fallacies, right? So there are these are certain red flags that you, as a layperson, if you are reading something or watching something or whatever, there are certain things that you can pick up as red flags that this is a not well structured argument, right? And ones that are very commonly used are things like, for example, ad hominem, which is when it's a logical fallacy where instead of trying to combat or argue against the subject of the debate, you try and tear down the argument by discrediting the person who's making it. So this happened a lot, for example, with Anthony Fauci in America. People attacked him a lot to try and discredit what he was saying about COVID vaccinations, right? Yes. And then you get like slippery slope fallacies, which is like an example of slippery slope fallacy is like if you have a restaurant that doesn't allow guide dogs, or service dogs, for example, and the owner's logic is, if I allow service dogs, then everyone's going to want to bring their dogs, and then the restaurant's going to be overrun by dogs, and there's going to be dog hair everywhere, and like that's a slippery slope. That's not how it's going to work. You're going to allow service dogs in, and you'll say no to other dogs. You know, but that kind of sensationalist, snowball is people are like, oh yeah, that really could happen. You know, like if I get this vaccine, then I'm going to get all the vaccines, and then I'm going to become a 5G robot or something. You know, it's like. No, there's no logic there. You know, you can very easily, reasonably deconstruct that argument. There's also ones that are like, for example, the appeal to ignorance, right? Like something may exist because we haven't proved it doesn't exist. So like there are fairies inside your head because I haven't proven that there aren't fairies inside your head.
They are?
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So people are saying, well, there could be all these additional side effects to vaccines
Daniel,
that may
I love
exist
how you're
because we
breaking
haven't
this down.
shown that they don't exist. And then there's another one, which is appeal to authority, which is where I am making an argument and I big up the authority of the person that I'm basing my argument off of, even though that authority may not be appropriate. So for example, if I say, hey, I watched a blog the other day, and this person said that you shouldn't eat like full cream yogurt. So I'm not going to anymore, and you shouldn't either. You know, but it's like, who was this person? What was this blog? Like, what are their sources? How did they come to this conclusion? Why are you just believing what they've said?
Yes.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So,
and that was always the argument for me, how people would believe, this was over, obviously the COVID time, how people would believe these sources. I always say to my mom, if it says forwarded many times, it's wrong. That's my argument to my mom all the time. Like, if I'm going to give you a rule of thumb, forwarded many times, please don't do it, And so it would just be amazing to me, or like really like jarring how, you would just go and follow these people that you don't know their qualifications, you don't know their background, but they come and they do like a 6-minute video on how terrible this vaccine is and how it's going to turn us into 5G robots and things like that. And it's just like, why would you not believe the actual institutions, the scientists that have been working with this?
This is the thing. And if the fundamental basis of this is scientists don't make claims unless we have data and evidence to back it up. And a good scientist, obviously there are people who don't do this, but good scientists will be the first people to say to you, I don't know the answer to that question, right? For example, I specialize in vaccines. If you wanted to ask me a question about physics, I would say to you, listen, I'm not an expert in physics. I can give you what I think, but I can't tell you whether or not that's right. But have you noticed that there is I don't know if it's like a trend in society, everyone has to have an opinion about everything and has to, like, people don't like saying that they don't know stuff. I watched a very funny video the other day of some, like one of those late night news talk shows in America. And they had a guy who went around and he went to interview people and he was like, hey, have you heard about this thing that happened last night? And he just totally made something up. And everyone was like, oh yeah, I do. And I have really strong feelings about that thing. Even though they had never heard about it before he said it. No one just said, oh, I don't have any opinions or thoughts on that. You know what I mean?
And when you spoke about, I can't remember the right wording, but you used the word ignorance. What also reminds me of it is that it's the fear of the unknown, and these people who come up with conspiracies are prying on that fear. And where the gap is on the education part. And I think why it happened a lot with COVID is it was because it's new. We don't know about it, and we were learning within this real time thing, So I think that they are running on the fear that people have, fear of the unknown, and then we did not do, or let me say, institutions did not do well enough in terms of education, So I think that prying on the people's fear of the unknown.
And there's two things that I want to say about that, and the first is that, just as a good scientist should say when they don't know something, good science evolves. And, if you look at, for example, like HIV has been around since the 80s. and we are still learning new things about HIV, you know, like from a virological perspective and how it works and that kind of stuff. And, you know, the fact that we know as much as we know about COVID in, you know, and I mean, especially if you look at in the first year, you know, it's just it was an immense effort by scientists to learn about it. There's going to be an evolution of knowledge, and you may find something, and then someone may find another level to it, or find something that actually works a bit differently. And that is why, you know, a big criticism during COVID was people saying, oh, you know, the one day the government recommends this, and then the next they recommend that, and then they contradict themselves. And well, it's because our understanding of the situation is evolving. So at first, for example, we said mask mandates have to be in place. Like masks make sense here. And then for subsequent lockdowns, they didn't have a mask mandate. And they said, you know, it's like we didn't handle that appropriately because now we have new data. But people interpret that as science
They're
being wrong.
Yeah, we
You know
don't
what I
know
mean?
enough about this.
And so there needs to be, I think, this is the other thing I want to say in response to what to your point is, this is where I think the onus needs to be on the scientists and the institutions and the government. Because it's all very well for us to sit here and say people who are vaccine hesitant use logical fallacies and they need to have more trust and whatever. But that needs to be developed from somewhere. And the biggest problem I have with a lot of scientists is that they really struggle to talk to lay people. They really struggle to say, you know, this is how the situation is working in a way that doesn't talk down to people or get overly technical or, you know, come from a position of like superiority or authority or that kind of thing. And I think that I really think that a lot of scientists could benefit from like going to like communication classes.
Absolutely.
You know what I mean? I mean, I always tell younger students to practice elevator pitches, right?
Yes.
Like you should be able to explain what your research is about to anyone in the time it takes for an elevator to go from the 1st to the 10th floor, right? And if you can't do that, then you need to really think about how like the words you're using and the points you're making, and you know, why is it that you can't communicate effectively to anyone about the essence of what it is you do? That doesn't mean explain the technicality of what you do to anyone. It means summarize what it is that you do, right? Now,
it's Albert Einstein who says if you can't explain it simply, you don't know it well enough.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the problem is that a lot of scientists, it's particularly during the pandemic, would say you need to do this, and this is why, and they would give a really technical reason. Then people would say, I don't understand, and they would say, just do it. Because we have told you to. That's not how you get people to agree with you. That's not how you foster trust, by just saying, well, I know more than you, so do what I say. You know what I mean?
Tell me, Daniel, what about, you know, like we heard the term herd immunity. How important is that? So we keep referring to COVID because I think that's the most, you know, recent example that was on a global scale that we all know of. But I'm talking about like even down to your baby vaccines, your flu shots that you get at the beginning of winter and things like that. How important are these things? So what I'm asking you, as a vaccinologist, can we get by without ever vaccinating?
No.
And what's the risk? Tell us.
So the reason that we can't get by without vaccinating is because the risk of disease is too great. And the cost of disease, both in terms of, I mean, literal cost, like economically, and in terms of lives, is too great, right? Let's just look at one vaccine preventable disease, right? And there are a lot, but let's zoom in just on measles. Before the introduction of a measles vaccine in 1963, about 2.6 million people died every year from measles.
Sure.
In 2021, about 128,000 people died of measles. So we've got that down from 2.6 million to just over 100,000, right? An amazing study was done, an economic study that showed that analyzed the impact of 10 vaccines in 94 low and middle income countries. And they showed that an investment of about $34 billion into vaccines would result in a direct savings of about $584 billion US dollars just through having to decrease healthcare and caring for the sick and that kind of thing, like the direct healthcare costs.
Yes.
And then when they factored in larger economic or broader economic factors, like, for example, every child that you save through vaccination will go on to contribute to the economy.
Yeah.
Right? You factor all those kinds of things in. They then estimated that the true gain, the true saving from a $34 billion investment in immunizations was actually about $1.5 trillion.
Wow.
Right?
Sure.
And we saw this during COVID. I mean, the hospitals were packed, you know?
Yeah.
And if
Yeah.
you were having another issue like a heart attack or a stroke, well, sorry, you know, we
dealing with
we
COVID
can't,
now.
yeah, we're dealing with an outbreak, right? Our healthcare systems, we have too many people that our healthcare systems cannot just be reactive, right? We need to be proactive.
Yes.
Now,
And that's what a vaccine is.
that is exactly what a
Yes.
vaccine is. And then with regards to herd immunity, what you want to achieve with herd immunity is just like how with all medications, some people may not derive pain relief from Panado. Some people will not develop protective immunity after getting a vaccine, right? Now, we try and make the vaccines as good as possible so that as few people as possible will not.
I love
react
what you're
positively.
saying. I love what you're saying. So you're saying that it's not 100%
It's not 100%.
that you will get immunity, but there's a better
Exactly.
chance. Yeah.
So
okay.
like a good vaccine has got an efficacy of like, I would say a good vaccine is anywhere from like 85 to like 95%, right? So if you like 85 to 95% of people will be protected, right?
Okay.
Now, because not everyone who gets it will be protected, we need to then obviously immunize more people than we would want to have protected in our population, right? So we want to have as high vaccine coverage as possible.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Now, the idea behind herd immunity is that there will always be vulnerable people in my population. There may be someone who is allergic to an ingredient in the vaccine and can't be vaccinated. That person is now vulnerable to the disease. There may be someone who got the vaccine but didn't get immunity.
Yes.
They're vulnerable. I want those vulnerable people to be pocketed and surrounded by people who are protected.
Yes.
Because
yes.
if you are a vulnerable person, but like everyone else in this room, for example,
Is
say I'm vulnerable,
protected.
but everyone else here is protected, then how's the pathogen going to get to me?
Yes.
Right?
Ah.
The
I hear
problem
you.
is when we have large groups of unprotected people, then the pathogen can spread around,
Quite
and that's when
quickly.
you get outbreaks.
I love what you're saying because
Right.
people will say, "Oh, I didn't get the vaccine and I'm fine," but the rest of us did for you.
Well, that's exactly it.
Yeah,
You know?
yeah.
And that's another thing, and that's another appeal. It was another approach that a lot of institutes used is even if you aren't vaccinating for yourself, vaccinate for someone else. You know,
Yes.
vaccinate for your parents or for your grandparents or you know for
Yes.
whoever.
Yes.
And that's it's a really important thing to consider. And you know, one thing that I always think about is if you Google iron lung wards, right, in the 1950s, polio. So polio is a disease that can cause paralysis, and people who get it, if they have a bad case, they need to be put in an iron lung to survive. And you have these pictures. I don't know if in the edit we can put up something or whatever, but you get these pictures of these warehouse-sized wards that are filled with iron lungs, and they're just people in. None of those exist anymore because we've controlled polio so much through
Yes.
vaccination.
Yes.
You know, and
Yeah.
all of those, anyone who would have been there, who got the vaccine and then didn't get polio, you know, the cost of keeping that person in healthcare, the economic stimulation that person is now putting into the economy, you know, the fact that that person can now have a life, and you know that kind of thing. You know, I mean, like it's hard when you look at something like that. It's hard not to see the effect that vaccines can have. But I think what is potentially the most important thing that one needs to understand. I can talk about the health economic impacts and I can talk about the sheer number of lives saved. But what we really need to understand is that when people say vaccines save lives, that's not technically true. vaccination saves lives. A vaccine that stays in its vial has an efficacy of 0, right? And as scientists, we can develop the best vaccines. We can develop the safest, most effective vaccines of all time. But if they are not getting out there and into people, then we're not saving lives. And you know what I would appeal to my peers and to the scientific community is, as much effort as we put into developing new vaccines, put equal effort into increasing vaccine uptake and vaccine acceptance.
So, Dan, I hear you talking all these great things about vaccinations, and it's true. I am a pro-vaxxer, obviously. You can hear by the way I'm asking questions. But I want to be somebody who, you know, touches all sides of, you know, both sides of the fence. When in history or in time or right now, can you give us an example of where it went completely wrong, where vaccines were on the wrong side?
For sure. I mean, there are very few cases where this has happened, but there are a couple. For example, there was an early vaccine against RSV, which is a respiratory virus, very, very high burden in infants. But there was an early example of this vaccine decades ago that actually caused what we call antibody-dependent enhancement, where people who had the vaccine and then got RSV actually got more sick.
Sure.
And it was very quickly spotted, and the vaccine was discontinued, and it was managed, and it actually didn't affect a huge number of people. And there was another case with a specific rotavirus vaccine that caused there was an adverse effect that could cause a like paralysis of the gastrointestinal tract, of like the small intestine in the babies. So as soon as that was seen as well, the vaccine was discontinued. So the thing is, like, when we put a vaccine out, we don't just say like, cool, we've done our clinical trial, like, you know, just go and give it to everyone. We continuously monitor licensure, post-marketing. We continually monitor the performance of the vaccine, because the more people you vaccinate, the more chance you have of finding rare side effects. So if you have a clinical trial where you have 10,000 people, like, okay, cool, you can detect a 1 in 10,000 side effect, maybe. But when I've vaccinated hundreds of thousands or millions, I'll find those rare ones. And but that is really, like, that is stringently monitored by your safety boards, by things like FDA. In South Africa, we have one called SAPRA. And as soon as there is an unacceptable risk with a product, whether it's a vaccination or a pharmaceutical product, it is discontinued. And there is a thorough investigation as to why is this thing happening, how could we fix it. So we take it really seriously.
Yeah, sure. I love to hear that. Once again, as a pro-vaxxer, of course, I love to hear things like that. But also, I think maybe just now the last question is, okay, how can we contribute? Who's the burden on to promote vaccines and to teach and educate? And, you know, how do we start destigmatizing? I mean, we're trying as podcasters to do episodes like this. But, you know, at an institutional level, is it on you guys, the vaccinologists? Is it the healthcare? Is it big pharma? You know, where does the burden lie?
Yeah. No, I mean, that's an excellent question. And in typical academic fashion, before I answer it, I just do want to make one point that I think is really important.
Yes.
And that's that the best argument that we can make for the safety of vaccines and to promote vaccines, and this is something we can work into when I answer your question, is if we just look at it from a statistical perspective, right? We have so many stats and metrics to show the safety and efficacy of these vaccines. If you look at COVID vaccines alone, 72% of the world's population, about 5.5 billion people, are vaccinated against COVID-19. If the vaccines truly were dangerous, or all these things that you know, that was claimed about them in conspiracy theories and whatever, you know, we would see it. There would be mass death and casualties, and it would be horrific.
I love what you're saying. I love what you're saying. The numbers are there.
Exactly. I mean, but I mean, and that's the recent pandemic and one vaccine. Think about how many vaccines have been given in the last 100 years that we've been vaccinating people, right? It's like, it must be in the hundreds of billions of doses, right? If vaccines were dangerous, there wouldn't be people left, it would be horrific.
Yes.
And I just, people always, harp on about the adverse effects and the safety issues, what. But the most important thing is that there is nothing, even Panado, if you read the package insert, or every pharmaceutical product has the risk of an adverse reaction, but statistically, your chances of being harmed by a vaccine are so small, and your chances of being harmed by the disease it's protecting you against are always so much higher, right?
There's a risk.
Exactly.
But if you look at the numbers, where does the bigger risk lie?
Exactly. I mean, like the heart thing with the myocarditis with the COVID vaccines, there's about a 7 in a million people would get it.
Yes.
But your chances of getting a myocarditis from COVID were about 20-fold higher.
Yes.
Wow.
Right?
Yeah.
But to answer your question, I think it's not a simple answer. Everyone needs to play a role in advocating and educating about vaccines. I think the biggest role player that can make the biggest difference in the short term is in your basic education. I think the more people we have who from a younger age are equipped with not necessarily the knowledge itself, but are equipped to be receptive to the knowledge, and are equipped to think critically about what they're being told, and people, the most important thing about education is being taught to think. People always say, oh, why do I have to do maths at school? I'm never going to use the quadratic formula in my life. You won't. But the way that you learn to think, to identify, oh, I need to use the quadratic formula here, that's a problem-solving skill. And when you apply that way of thinking to other things in life, like discerning whether or not what I'm being told by this person is reasonable and logical, or if I maybe am being misled, that starts in basic education. Then I think government has to play a role in pushing for vaccination campaigns and that kind of thing, and institutions need to also there is a lot of information that institutes or organizations like WHO and CDC and that kind of stuff, like they put out a lot, but I think it could maybe be increased, and it could maybe be made more accessible and made more like, maybe the language used could be simplified sometimes. And I think that there is definitely a substantial role for people like us, podcasters or individual scientists or whatever, to go out there and advocate and spread,
like you're doing right now with your time.
And I think, what I just really want to achieve is we live in a world where we have more information at our fingertips than we could ever have imagined. We have literal supercomputers, and all the computer science people, I know that they aren't actually supercomputers, but but you can access everything that humankind knows in a matter of seconds, right? The problem is that you can also access everything humankind has ever made up, right? Yes. And it can, the most difficult thing, I think, growing up in today's world is telling whether or not what you're reading is something that is fact or something that is fiction, and that's what we need to try and do. And like what I feel is a big mission for me as a scientist is I want to put out as much quality information as someone else is putting out bad information. And I want to help people be equipped to recognize the quality information compared to the bad information. You know what I mean? So all those parts like the government and the educators and the institutions play a role, but really if we're not doing it cohesively and together, we're not going to achieve it.
I love you. Thank you. Before I ask another question, I was about to like roll into another one, and I had to pause myself right there. That's Mr. Dan Kapelus. The next time we speak to him, we'll probably be Dr. Dan Kapelus. Thank you so much for taking the time. Like you said, in doing this, you're also one of those people that are promoting and advocating for the use of and spreading knowledge. I think that's more, importantly, just it's not just to say get vaccinated, why, and that's what you've taken the time to do. Thank you so much for that. Thank you. That was today's episode of the Conversation Capital. For now, though, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Goodbye, and God bless.